Like Caravaggio and Rembrandt, you too can use light to breathe life into your imagery.
Say hello.
Hello! Today we're going to talk about lighting settings and setups. First things first, it's good to be familiar with your lighting settings in your projects panel. At the top here we have lighting presets, which are good for different situations. If you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of things, you can just stick to what these immediately toggle to, or you can use them as a baseline to continue editing. Basic is what you have on when you first open up the program. It's, nothing too crazy, just sort of a baseline set of settings. Product mode is optimized for product scale rendering. It has both direct and indirect or reflected light, a little bit more realistic shadows, and more realism in translucent and semi-translucent materials. Interior mode is optimized for interiors and architectural rendering. It has less detailed shadows than product mode, but more reflected bounce light or ray bounces and more diffused reflected light, expressed as global illumination in Keyshot. Jewelry mode has more detailed shadows with a whole lot of ray bounces, but less global illumination, and most importantly, caustics, which simulates the bending of light as it passes through transparent materials like glass or gemstones. The Custom tab is where you can access lighting presets that you've made, which you can make with all these fancy buttons and sliders down here. Shadow quality controls the amount of detail that are put into shadows. Below that, we have ground illumination and self shadows. These control the bounce light reflected off the ground and the shadows cast by geometry you introduce into the scene respectively. In general lighting, we have ray bounces, which controls the maximum number of times a light ray bounces within the scene. Global illumination is specifically diffused light rays that bounce between your geometry, and I already told you what caustics are, but because I like you so much, we'll talk about it again. Caustics toggles on the calculations of the warpage of light as it passes through curved and transparent materials like glass, water, or other reflective and transparent materials. This setting is the key to realistically rendering glass and liquid, but if you're not working on a super powerful machine, it can really put the ringer on your computer, as can a whole lot of ray bounces. Both of these things can lead to fireflies or other hiccups in the renderings that you might produce. At the bottom here, we have rendering techniques. Product mode is optimized for products, and interior mode is optimized for interiors, specifically in relation to whether the camera is in an enclosed space or not. But there's one important thing to know about these different settings. In product mode, material samples are used specifically for upsampling challenging materials and lightings, like area lights or emissive materials, what have you. However, interior mode uses a more complex and intelligent approach for sampling, which can make material samples less effective since it's already upsampling in places that might need it. Formatting these settings should mostly be driven by the scale of the environment that you're rendering in, and also the types of materials that you'll be using. For instance, glasses benefit from caustics, whereas if you're doing something that's all hard plastics, it's less important and it's probably just adding, unnecessary strain on your computer. Moving on, we're going to get into environmental lighting and building scenes in the Environments tab. Up top we have the Manager, which can be used to switch through different environments that you've built out. Here you can also duplicate, lock, and add to studios, just like with cameras. To add to studios, you can either hit this guy right here, or you can go into your Windows tab, come down to Studios, and open it that way, or just by hitting U on your keyboard. Below that is the editing view of your high dynamic range image, or HDRI. Keyshot comes with a bunch of pre-made HDRIs and the ability to make one from scratch pretty easily. You can also find other HDRIs and libraries available online. To open a downloaded HDRI, you can use this right here to browse your computer files. Below that are general environment settings like brightness of the environment as a whole, contrast, and some dimensional editing tools which are important if you're trying to render a large scene or simulate a large environment. Next we have your background option. You can switch between using your lighting environment as a background, a flat color, or a backplate image that you might upload. Next we've got the ground plane settings. If you're using a ground plane, it's important to make sure you've sized it correctly with the ground size slider. It's also important to make sure you've got your shadows and reflections turned on, and if you want more complex shadows, occlusion ground shadows too. Flattening the ground will create a ground plane by projecting the bottom of your environment to a flat surface where the ground would be. Switching into the HDRI editor, you have the ability to edit your background. Switching between a flat color, a gradient, a sun and sky simulator, which you can use to artificially recreate a certain time of day, or an image. Each background setup has a different set of settings that are all pretty self-explanatory, so yeah, I trust you to figure that out. Now we've got your pin lights. These four dudes create a basic pin light, a gradient pin light, an image pin light, and a copy pin light. Your basic pin light is your essential studio light. When you select it, you can edit the basic shapes, the radius, color, brightness, fall off, and blending of the light. Gradient lights function more or less the same, except you get to set up a gradient that the light will have ranging from the center to the outside. Image pins allow you to use an image from your computer as a light source, which can be helpful if you're trying to introduce some natural light or just light from a setting into your render. Copy pins take a section of your HDRI and use it as a pin. See that little yellow dot there? That is where this copy pin is supposedly drawing from. Pin lights can be moved by selecting the handle and dragging it around the scene, or by selecting the crosshairs here and clicking on a surface that you wish to put a highlight or the focus of the selected pin light. As with most things in life, lighting setups are usually best kept simple, by which I mean a lighting setup like this is generally going to do better than a lighting setup like this, as well as this being kind of difficult to manage and control. Once you have an environment you like, you can save it to your library with this guy, or you can export it as a HDRI file similar to what you would have imported. Sometimes lighting environments just aren't enough though. This is where geometry lighting comes in. Certain setups are only achievable or most easily achievable through introducing geometry to a scene and assigning a light material to it as if it was an actual light within an environment. I want to be clear, geometry lights are a really good way of achieving more dynamic highlights and shadows, and also can just generally lead to a more realistic lighting scene. But if you're working on a less powerful machine, they can be really taxing because materials like area lights, they just ask a lot from your computer. They add a lot more calculations into the mix-up. Because of that, if you're going to be using a geometry light, it's good to know what your machine can handle ahead of time and also have your settings properly tuned to deal with the added light source. To create a geometry light, either import your own geometry or add stock geometry. Usually a sphere is a good way to start. Take your shape, position it how you'd like, and then add a area light or a spotlight or whatever other light you might be interested in adding. The amount of light emitted by a light material is controlled by the power settings in its materials settings. The unit of this power setting can be set to watts, lumens, or lux. Watts being most similar to an electric light, although lumens and lux are the ones that I would suggest going with. Lumens represent a consistent power output for a given surface, meaning the light put out by a small surface with the same amount of lumens as a big surface is going to generate the same light in an area, whereas lux represents the amount of lumens per square surface area unit of a surface. Basically meaning that as a surface that has a lux power material applied to it gets bigger, so does the light output. Another good trick you can pull with geometry lights is applying an image as a label and making it emissive. This is a good way of, similar to the image pin that we were talking about earlier, introducing natural light, and also can be used to fake outdoor environments in mirrors or through windows. I tend to like using an image plate as opposed to a pin, even if I'm just trying to introduce more natural color to a scene, just because I find that you have more of the color directly hitting the surfaces that you want it to when the actual image light source is closer to the object that you're rendering. In terms of setups, typically the cleaner you can make it, the better, but every different project is going to need a different lighting setup just because the things that you're trying to communicate will be different. Like what I talked about in the planning video, where you should know what the goals of your project are before you enter Keyshot. This is where a lot of that's going to pay off. You know, knowing exactly how you want to light it. If you want more of like a sunny, single direction, hard light, with, pretty crisp shadows versus, very dramatic underglow or something like that. These are communicating different things and, for those reasons are appropriate for different projects. So big picture, make sure your lighting settings are appropriate for your machine and your project. Set up your HDRI, add a little extra flair with geometry lights, and then render. Oh, but how might you render something? And what are samples? And what are all these other passes that are available to you? Can you guess what the next video is about? Anyways, as always, if you have any other questions, message me or Kyle, and good luck.